The fog came in thick that morning, rolling across the Debden airfield like smoke from a dying fire. First Lieutenant Jack Miller stood outside the operations hut, watching the gray curtains swallow the hardstands where the big Republic fighters sat waiting. Somewhere out there, barely visible through the mist, his P-47 Thunderbolt was being prepared for the day's mission. He could hear the mechanics working, their voices muffled and distant, punctuated by the clank of tools against metal. Miller was 23 years old, though he felt older. The insignia on his leather A2 jacket told part of his story. The patch of the 56th Fighter Group, freshly sewn on, still stiff with newness. But it was the small row of marks painted beneath his canopy rail that mattered most. 5 small Japanese flags. 5 confirmed victories over the Pacific, earned in the brutal skies above Guadalcanal before his transfer stateside for training duty. Then had come the unexpected orders. England, the 8th Air Force, the war against Germany. "They say the Krauts don't turn fight," said a voice behind him. Miller turned to see Second Lieutenant Bobby Chen, fresh out of flight school, barely 21, with the kind of eager face that made Miller feel ancient. They climb, and they never fight alone. Miller had heard the same rumors during the briefings. The Luftwaffe supposedly fought differently than the Japanese. No wild dogfights, no kamikaze determination. Instead, calculated attacks from altitude, disciplined formations, veteran pilots who'd been fighting since 1939. He'd listened politely, but part of him remained skeptical. Air combat was air combat. He'd already proven himself against one enemy. How different could another be? "That's what they tell us," Miller replied, pulling his cigarette pack from his jacket pocket. He offered one to Chen, who declined with a shake of his head. Miller lit his own, cupping his hands against the damp morning air. "We'll find out soon enough." The briefing had been straightforward. The 56th would be escorting B-17 Flying Fortresses on a daylight raid into Germany, their first real mission against the Luftwaffe. Miller's flight would fly high cover, positioned above and behind the bomber stream, watching for enemy fighters. The weatherman had promised the fog would burn off by 0900 hours. The intelligence officer had been less optimistic about enemy opposition. "Expect heavy resistance," he'd said, tapping his pointer against the map. The Luftwaffe has concentrated fighter groups in this sector, primarily Messerschmitt 109s and Focke-Wulf 190s. They'll hit the bombers hard, and they won't be happy to see you. Now, waiting for the fog to lift, Miller found himself thinking about those enemy pilots. Were they standing on their own airfields right now, drinking coffee, checking their aircraft? Were they veterans or novices? Did they know American fighters were coming? "Lieutenant Miller!" The operations officer appeared in the doorway, clipboard in hand. "Weather's clearing faster than expected. We're moving up the takeoff time. Get your flight ready. 30 minutes. Miller dropped his cigarette and crushed it under his boot. "You heard him, Bobby. Round up the others. Time to earn our pay." The fog was indeed lifting, tearing apart in ragged sheets as the morning sun finally broke through. Miller walked toward his aircraft, his parachute already slung over his shoulder, his Mae West life preserver secured around his torso. The P-47 emerged from the mist like a ghost becoming solid. 7 tons of American engineering, painted in olive drab and neutral gray, with the White Star insignia bright against its fuselage. His crew chief, Sergeant Mike Romano, stood beside the big fighter, wiping his hands on an oil-stained rag. Romano was 35, too old for combat flying, but too stubborn to stay stateside. He'd been maintaining fighters since before Miller had learned to drive. "She's ready, Lieutenant," Romano said, patting the Thunderbolt's broad wing. "Topped off the fuel, checked the guns 3 times. 850s, all loaded and clean. You've got about 267 rounds per gun." Miller nodded, running his hand along the wing's leading edge. The metal was cold and slightly damp. "How's the engine?" "Purring like a kitten. Well, a 2,000 horsepower kitten." Romano grinned, then his expression turned serious. "Bring her back in one piece, sir. And yourself, too." "That's the plan, Mike." Miller climbed onto the wing, settling into the cockpit with the practiced ease of hundreds of hours of flight time. The seat embraced him, familiar and comfortable despite the bulky parachute beneath him. He began his checks: fuel mixture, propeller pitch, trim tabs, gun switches safe. Everything had its place, its procedure, its rhythm. This was the part he understood completely. Around the field, other P-47s were coming to life. The big Pratt & Whitney radial engines coughed, sputtered, then caught with a roar that shook the ground. Blue smoke blasted from exhausts as 18 cylinders began their violent, synchronized dance. Miller primed his own engine, set the mixture rich, and hit the starter. The propeller blade jerked, rotated once, twice, then the engine fired. The noise was immense, even through his leather helmet, a deep thunder that he felt in his chest. The entire aircraft vibrated, eager and powerful. He let it warm up, watching the cylinder head temperature climb, checking oil pressure, scanning his gauges with the automatic attention of a pilot who knew his life depended on these instruments. The radio crackled in his ears. "Keyworth Leader, this is Debden Tower. You're cleared for takeoff. Wind is 080 at 12 knots. Altimeter 299er2. Good hunting." "Roger, Tower," replied Major Harrison, the group commander. "Keyworth Flight, let's go to work." Miller released his brakes and added power, the Thunderbolt rolling forward with surprising grace despite its bulk. They taxied out in formation, 16 fighters moving toward the runway in a disciplined line. The fog was nearly gone now, leaving only wisps along the tree line. The sky above was clearing to a pale blue. One by one, the P-47s thundered down the runway and lifted into the English morning. Miller felt the familiar surge as his aircraft gathered speed, the tail coming up, the rumble of wheels on concrete giving way to sudden smoothness as the wings took hold of the air. He was flying again, and for a moment, everything else fell away. The war, the fear, the weight of responsibility. There was only the aircraft, and the sky, and the pure physics of flight. They climbed out over the channel, forming up into combat spread formation. Miller flew as element leader, with Chen on his wing, positioned several hundred feet to his right and slightly behind. The B-17s were already visible ahead, a massive formation of heavy bombers stacked in boxes, their contrails writing white lines across the sky. "Beautiful, aren't they?" Chen's voice came through the radio, tinged with awe. Miller had to agree. The sight of so many bombers flying together was impressive and sobering. Each one carried 10 men. The entire formation represented hundreds of lives depending on the fighters to keep them safe. "Stay sharp, Bobby," Miller replied. "When the Germans come, they won't be admiring the view." They crossed into enemy territory at 28,000 feet, the earth far below a patchwork of fields and forests, roads like gray threads, towns like scattered toys. The air was thin and cold up here, ice crystals forming on Miller's canopy despite the morning sun. His oxygen mask covered his face, delivering the pressurized air that kept him conscious at this altitude. The minutes stretched out. Miller scanned the sky constantly, the way he'd been trained, a methodical search pattern, focusing at different distances, never staring at any one spot too long. High, low, behind, ahead, empty blue sky, scattered clouds, the steady drone of his engine. Then, "Bandits! High! 11 o'clock!" Miller's heart jumped. He snapped his head left and up, searching. For a few seconds, he saw nothing. Then, there. Black specks against the blue, impossibly high, diving down toward the bombers like hawks toward pigeons. "Keyworth Flight! Tanks away!" Major Harrison's command cracked through the radio. Miller hit the release, jettisoning his external fuel tanks. They fell away tumbling, and suddenly his Thunderbolt felt lighter, more responsive. The German fighters came down fast, very fast, and Miller realized with a start that they'd been waiting up there, positioned perfectly, watching the entire formation approach. This wasn't a meeting engagement. This was an ambush. The first pass came like thunder. The German fighters, Miller counted at least a dozen Messerschmitt 109s, slashed through the bomber formation with devastating speed. He saw tracer fire arcing through the sky, bright lines of destruction that seemed to hang in the air. One B-17 staggered, smoke pouring from its number 3 engine. Another shuddered as cannon shells walked across its wing. "Brake left! Brake left!" someone screamed over the radio, the discipline of proper procedure forgotten in the chaos. Miller pushed his stick forward and left, diving toward the melee. Chen stayed with him, the young pilot holding formation despite the madness erupting around them. This was it, his first engagement against the Luftwaffe. Everything he'd trained for, everything he'd been told to expect, compressed into this moment of violence and speed. He picked out a target, a lone 109 pulling up from its attack run, climbing back toward altitude. The German fighter was painted in mottled gray-green camouflage, black crosses stark on its fuselage and wings. It looked smaller than the P-47, more delicate, but it climbed with an urgency that surprised Miller. Fast. Very fast. "I've got the single climbing out," Miller called. "Bobby, stay high and cover me." "Roger, Hawk," Chen replied, using Miller's call sign. Miller turned hard, pulling the Thunderbolt into pursuit. The German pilot must have seen him coming, because the 109 rolled inverted and pulled through, reversing direction with startling agility. Miller tried to follow, hauling back on his stick, feeling the G-forces crush him down into his seat. His vision began to gray at the edges. The Thunderbolt groaned, its massive airframe protesting the violent maneuver. The German was inside his turn. Impossible. The P-47 should have been able to outturn a 109 at this speed. But somehow, the enemy pilot had made it work, and now Miller found himself fighting for position against an opponent who seemed to anticipate his every move. They spiraled upward, trading altitude for angles, each pilot seeking the advantage. Miller fired a burst, more to test range than with any real hope of hitting. His 8 Browning machine guns hammered, the recoil shuddering through the airframe. Tracer rounds reached out and fell short. The German jinked left, then right, never holding a steady course long enough to present a clean shot. Miller's training took over. Energy management. Speed equals life. He'd learned it in the Pacific, refined it in countless hours of practice. He checked his airspeed, 210 miles per hour and falling. They were getting slow, dangerously slow, bleeding energy in this climbing spiral. The Germans seemed to sense it too. The 109's nose suddenly pitched up sharply, almost vertical, then snapped over the top in a hammerhead stall turn. Miller tried to follow and realized his mistake instantly. The Thunderbolt was too heavy, too laden with momentum. As he pulled vertical, his speed washed off completely. The controls went mushy. The aircraft hung on its propeller for one terrible second, vulnerable and helpless. The German came back down at him like a falling sword. Miller saw the muzzle flashes before he heard the guns, bright sparkles along the 109's nose and wings. Cannon shells and machine gun bullets reached toward him. He shoved the stick forward desperately, adding power, trying to get the nose down and speed back. Something hit his aircraft with a tremendous bang. The Thunderbolt shuddered. Alarms screamed, hydraulic pressure dropping. A hole punched through his left wing, daylight visible where metal should be. Another impact somewhere aft, a vibration that felt wrong, felt deadly. "Hawk, you're smoking!" Chen's voice, high and tight with fear. Miller looked back. White vapor was streaming from somewhere beneath his fuselage, mixing with darker smoke. Coolant leak, or worse, he couldn't tell. His engine temperature was climbing, oil pressure fluctuating. The Germans had told him true. These pilots didn't miss when they had their shot. The 109 pulled up again, climbing away, and Miller saw it clearly for the first time. The aircraft was pristine, professionally maintained, flown with absolute confidence. And on its fuselage, beneath the canopy, he saw a row of small vertical bars. Victory marks. Many of them. Too many to count in the brief glimpse he had. This wasn't some novice. This was a veteran. Probably an ace many times over. And Miller had just made every mistake in the book fighting him. "Bobby, I'm hit," Miller said, forcing his voice to stay calm. "I need to break off." "Roger, I'm with you." Miller rolled the P-47 inverted and pulled, diving away from the fight. The 109 didn't follow. It was already climbing back to altitude, looking for another victim. The German pilot had won this engagement and knew it. There was no need to waste ammunition finishing off a damaged enemy who was already leaving. The dive helped. Miller's speed built quickly, the big Pratt & Whitney engine still producing power despite the damage. Wind screamed past the canopy, the altimeter unwound, 24,000 feet, 22,000, 20,000. The smoke lessened as speed increased and cooling air flowed over the hot metal. He pulled out at 15,000 feet, leveling off, taking stock. Chen formed up beside him, the young pilot's face visible through his canopy, eyes wide with concern. Miller checked his instruments again. Oil pressure stabilizing, temperature still high but not critical. The vibration remained, but it wasn't getting worse. "How bad is it?" Chen asked. "Bad enough," Miller replied. He tried his controls. Stick and rudder responded normally. The hole in his wing wasn't near any critical structure. Maybe, just maybe, he could make it home. "But I think she'll fly. Let's head back." They turned west, leaving the battle behind. Miller could still hear the radio chatter, voices calling out bandits and breaks and kills, the confused symphony of aerial combat. He'd been part of it for perhaps 3 minutes. It felt like hours. The flight back to England was the longest of Miller's life. Every sound from the engine made him tense, every vibration a potential catastrophe. He kept his hand near the canopy release, ready to bail out if the Thunderbolt decided to quit on him. Chen stayed close, flying escort, watching for enemy fighters that might try to pick off a damaged straggler. They crossed the channel at 8,000 feet. Miller had descended gradually, trading altitude for the safety of thicker air where he could breathe without oxygen if needed. The English coast appeared ahead, gray cliffs and green fields, the most beautiful thing he'd ever seen. Debden appeared in the distance. Miller called the tower, reported his damage, requested priority landing. They cleared him straight in, emergency vehicles standing by. He configured the aircraft carefully, landing gear down, flaps incrementally, watching to see if the damaged hydraulics would hold. Everything worked. The Republic engineers had built this aircraft to take punishment and keep flying. The runway rose to meet him. Wheels touched concrete, a bounce, then solid contact. He let the tail settle and applied brakes gently, not trusting the damaged systems fully. The Thunderbolt rolled out and turned onto the taxiway, trailing smoke, but alive, functional, home. Romano was waiting when Miller shut down the engine. The crew chief climbed onto the wing and stared at the damage, his face gone pale. 3 cannon shell hits, one through the wing, one through the tail section, one that had punched into the fuselage behind the cockpit and somehow missed every vital system. Dozens of smaller holes from machine gun bullets peppered the aircraft's skin. "Jesus, Lieutenant," Romano whispered. "How are you alive?" Miller climbed out of the cockpit on shaking legs. Now that the adrenaline was fading, he felt weak, sick, overwhelmed. He'd been in combat before. He'd shot down enemy aircraft before. But this had been different. This had been a lesson delivered with cannon shells and machine gun bullets. A brutal education in just how outclassed he really was. "I don't know, Mike," he said honestly. "I really don't know." The debriefing was subdued. Of the 16 P-47s that had taken off that morning, 14 returned. 1 pilot was dead, shot down over Germany. Another had bailed out over the channel and been rescued by air-sea rescue, bruised but alive. The group had claimed 4 enemy aircraft destroyed, 2 probables. Against that, the bombers had lost 3 B-17s with their entire crews, 30 men who wouldn't be coming home. Major Harrison listened to each pilot's report, making notes, asking questions. When Miller's turn came, he described the engagement honestly. His pursuit of the lone 109, the turning fight, his mistakes, the damage he'd sustained. The German pilot was good, Miller concluded, Better than good. He knew exactly what he was doing. He baited me into a slow-speed fight, then executed a perfect reversal. I was lucky to get away. Harrison nodded slowly. You were lucky. And you learned something. That makes you one of the smart ones, Lieutenant. A lot of pilots don't survive their first lesson from the Luftwaffe. After the debriefing, Miller walked back to his quarters, still wearing his flight suit, still tasting the rubber from his oxygen mask. Other pilots were gathered in small groups, drinking coffee, smoking, talking in low voices. The easy confidence from this morning was gone, replaced by something harder, more wary. Bobby Chen caught up with him outside the barracks. You okay, Hawk? Yeah, Miller said, though he wasn't sure it was true. You did good up there, Bobby. Stayed with me, kept your head. That's worth more than you know. I was terrified, Chen admitted. When I saw you smoking, I thought... I know, but you stayed anyway. That's what counts. Sleep didn't come easy that night. Miller lay in his bunk, staring at the ceiling, replaying the engagement over and over in his mind. Every turn, every decision, every mistake stood out with painful clarity. He'd been arrogant. Not openly, not in words, but in his assumptions. He'd thought his experience in the Pacific had prepared him for this. He'd been wrong. Around 0300 hours, he gave up on sleep entirely. He dressed quietly, careful not to wake the other pilots in the barracks, and walked out into the cold English night. The sky was clear, stars brilliant overhead, the same stars that shone over Germany, where enemy pilots were probably sleeping peacefully, confident in their superiority. The operations hut was dark except for a single light burning in the intelligence section. Miller pushed open the door and found Captain William Rhodes hunched over a desk covered with photographs and reports. Rhodes was the group intelligence officer, a former college professor who'd volunteered for service despite his age, pushing 40, old by fighter pilot standards. Can't sleep either? Rhodes asked without looking up. No, sir. Miller pulled up a chair. What are you working on? Rhodes pushed a photograph across the desk. It showed a German fighter in flight captured by a bomber's camera gun. Even in the grainy black and white image, Miller recognized the distinctive shape, a Messerschmitt 109, the same type that had nearly killed him. I've been studying these reports for months, Rhodes said. Every engagement, every encounter, trying to understand how they fight. The pattern is consistent. The Luftwaffe doesn't dogfight the way the Japanese do. They don't chase. They don't commit to extended turning battles. They attack once, hard, from advantage, then disengage and reset for another pass. Energy tactics, Miller said. Exactly. They treat altitude like money in the bank. They climb high, wait for us to pass below, then dive down with all that potential energy converted to speed. They make one firing pass, then use their excess speed to climb back up. If we chase them in the climb, we bleed off our speed and become vulnerable. If we don't chase, they just reset and do it again. Miller thought about his engagement, how the German had climbed away after damaging him, how easily the 109 had gained altitude. So how do we beat them? Rhodes lit a cigarette, the match flare briefly illuminating his tired face. That's the question everyone's asking. The British have been fighting them since 1940. They've learned a few things. First, never fight alone. The Germans hunt in pairs, a leader and a wingman. The wingman's only job is to protect his leader's tail. If you chase the leader, the wingman kills you. So we need to do the same. Tight discipline, mutual support, never break formation chasing a single enemy. What else? Use your aircraft's strengths. The P-47 is faster than the 109 in a dive, much faster. It's also tougher. You proved that today when you brought yours home full of holes. And at high altitude, above 25,000 feet, you have better performance than they do. The Thunderbolt was built for stratospheric fighting. Rhodes pulled out another report, this one typed on official stationery. This is from the 4th Fighter Group. They've been here longer than we have, flying P-47 since earlier this year. They've developed some tactics. When the Germans attack from above, Don't try to turn with them. Instead, split your formation. Half breaks left, half breaks right. The Germans have to commit to one side or the other. Whichever side they don't choose becomes the hunters instead of the hunted. Miller absorbed this, his tactical mind working through the implications. And if they do commit to your side? You dive. Use your speed. The P-47 can outdive anything the Germans have. Push it to 400, 450 miles per hour if you need to. The 109's control surfaces stiffen up at high speed. Their pilots can barely move the stick. But the Thunderbolt stays controllable. You dive away, build separation, then use all that speed to climb back up somewhere else. You've converted their altitude advantage into your speed advantage. But you have to be disciplined, Miller said, understanding now. You have to resist the temptation to turn and fight. Exactly. And that's the hard part. Every instinct tells you to turn toward the enemy, to face the threat. But against the Luftwaffe, that instinct will get you killed. You have to think differently. You have to fight smarter, not harder. They talked for another hour, Rhodes sharing everything he knew, Miller asking questions, both of them sketching diagrams on paper, working through scenarios. By the time Miller left the operations hut, the sky was beginning to lighten in the east. He felt something he hadn't felt since landing yesterday. Hope. Not confidence, not yet, but at least a path forward. The next 2 days were scrubbed due to weather. Heavy clouds rolled in from the Atlantic, grounding everything. Miller used the time. He gathered the other pilots in his flight, Chen, Second Lieutenant Tom Patterson, and Second Lieutenant James Burke, and shared what he'd learned. They sat in the ready room with a blackboard, and Miller drew diagrams, explained energy fighting, talked about discipline and mutual support. The Germans have been doing this since before we were in the war, Miller told them. They've refined their tactics through thousands of engagements. We're not going to beat them by being braver or more aggressive. We're going to beat them by being smarter and working together. Patterson, a lanky kid from Texas with 20 kills against Japanese aircraft, was skeptical. You're saying we should run from them? I'm saying we should fight on our terms, not theirs. If they're above us, we don't climb to meet them. We make them come down to us. If they attack, we don't turn into them. We split and force them to commit. And if we're losing an engagement, we don't stay and slug it out. We use our speed to disengage, reset, and choose a better moment to fight. Sounds like a lot of running, Patterson muttered. It sounds like staying alive, Burke countered. Burke was older, 28, had been an instructor pilot before volunteering for combat. He understood what Miller was saying. I'd rather run 10 times and fight once on my terms than die trying to prove how brave I am. Chen nodded agreement. I was there yesterday. I saw what happened to Hawk. That German pilot could have killed him easily. The only reason Hawk's alive is because the German chose to break off. We were outclassed, and we need to admit that before we can do better. Patterson's expression softened. All right, I hear you. So what's the plan? Miller tapped the blackboard. We stay together, always, no matter what. If one of us attacks, the others support. If one of us is attacked, the others engage. We watch each other's tails like our lives depend on it, because they do. And we use our radios. The Germans are good at appearing out of nowhere, but if we're all scanning, all talking, we increase our chances of seeing them first. They drilled on it, walking through scenarios, practicing the calls they'd make, the maneuvers they'd execute. It felt awkward at first, too planned, too scripted. But Miller insisted. Discipline in training meant discipline in combat, and discipline in combat meant survival. On the third day, the weather cleared. Mission briefing was at 0600 hours. Another bomber escort, deeper into Germany this time, hitting aircraft factories near Bremen. The Luftwaffe would definitely oppose this one. Major Harrison addressed the assembled pilots. Intelligence reports heavy fighter concentrations in the target area. Expect aggressive opposition. Remember your training. Stay in formation. Support each other. Don't chase bandits away from the bombers. That's what they want you to do. Our job is to protect the big friends, not to rack up individual scores. Miller's flight drew high cover again, 29,000 feet, positioned to intercept any German fighters trying to attack the bombers from above. As they crossed the Dutch coast, Miller felt the familiar tension returning. But this time it was different. This time he knew what to expect. This time he had a plan. "Eyes open, everyone," he called over the radio. "Check your six regularly. Scan above us. They like to wait up high." "Roger, Hawk," Chen replied. The minutes crawled past. Germany unfolded below, a landscape of forests and cities, rivers like silver ribbons. The bomber stream left contrails behind them, white scars across the blue sky that would be visible for miles. Any German controller could follow those trails straight to the formation. "Contact! High! 2 o'clock!" Burke's voice calm and clear. "Angels 35, looks like a full staffel." Miller looked up and right. There, black specks against the sun, at least 12 aircraft, possibly more. They were positioned perfectly, 5,000 or 6,000 feet above the American fighters, waiting for the right moment to pounce. "I see them," Miller confirmed. "Everyone stay together. Let them come to us. Don't climb after them." It went against every aggressive instinct he had. The enemy was right there, in sight, vulnerable. The urge to attack was overwhelming. But Miller held formation, held discipline, watched and waited. The Germans waited too. For several minutes, both formations flew parallel courses, neither committing. Miller realized what was happening. The German leader was being patient, looking for a mistake, waiting for some American pilot to break formation and chase them. It was a test of discipline, and Miller was determined not to fail it. Then the bombers reached the initial point, beginning their bombing run, and the Germans could wait no longer. They rolled over and came down, not directly at Miller's flight, but at another group of P-47s, positioned lower and forward. "Keyworth leader, bandits attacking Blue Jay flight," someone called. "Hawk, we going to help?" Patterson asked, tension in his voice. Miller made his decision. "Negative. We hold position. The Germans want us to chase down there, then another group will bounce us from above. We stay high and watch." And he was right. 30 seconds later, Chen called out, "More bandits! 6 o'clock high! Coming down now!" Miller snapped his head around and saw them. 8 more Messerschmitts, diving down from behind and above, coming fast. They'd been lurking even higher, waiting for the first German group to draw away the American fighters. Classic tactic, and Miller had almost fallen for it. Break right! Miller commanded. "Split formation. Patterson and Burke go left. Chen, stay with me." The flight exploded outward, 4 P-47s diverging in opposite directions with violent turns. The attacking Germans had to choose, and they chose left, going after Patterson and Burke. Miller had anticipated this. The moment the Germans committed, he reversed his turn. "Chen, we're going after them. Full power, shallow dive, build speed." "Roger, Hawk." Miller pushed his throttle to the firewall and nosed down slightly, not into a steep dive, but a gradual descent that let the big Pratt & Whitney engine accelerate the Thunderbolt without losing altitude too quickly. His airspeed built, 280 miles per hour, 300, 320. The Germans were focused on Patterson and Burke, setting up for their firing pass, not watching their own tails. "Patterson, brake hard left in 3, 2, 1, brake!" Patterson's P-47 snapped into a vicious left turn, pulling hard, G-forces pressing him down. The German leader tried to follow, but couldn't match the turn radius at his higher speed. He overshot, pulling up to avoid losing his advantage, and that was when Miller arrived. The range was perfect, 300 yards and closing. Miller put his illuminated gunsight pipper on the climbing Messerschmitt and pressed the trigger. All 8 Browning machine guns erupted, the recoil shuddering through the airframe. Tracer rounds reached out like angry hornets, and Miller saw them walk up the 109's fuselage. Pieces flew off. Smoke poured from the engine. The canopy shattered. The German fighter rolled inverted and fell away, streaming fire. Miller didn't watch it go. He was already looking for the next threat. But the other German pilots had seen their leader go down, and suddenly, the hunters became the hunted. They broke formation, scattering, abandoning their attack. "Chen, stay with Patterson and Burke," Miller ordered. "I'm going to clear our 6." He pulled up hard, converting his speed back into altitude, climbing away from the fight. This was the discipline Rhodes had talked about. Not chasing the scattering enemy, not trying to pile up individual victories, but maintaining situational awareness and returning to position. A glance at his instruments showed everything normal. No damage, plenty of fuel, all systems functioning. The radio was chaos again, multiple flights calling out contacts, but Miller filtered through it, listening for his own people. Patterson reported he was okay. Burke confirmed the same. Chen was with them, all 3 aircraft rejoining into formation. Miller climbed back to their assigned altitude and found them waiting. "Good work, everyone. Patterson, nice break. Burke, good eyes on that second group. Chen, perfect wingman discipline." "You got one, Hawk," Patterson said, and there was respect in his voice now, the skepticism from 2 days ago completely gone. "Clean kill." Miller felt nothing about it. No elation, no satisfaction. Just grim acknowledgement. One German pilot was dead, but the mission wasn't over. The bombers were still vulnerable, and there would be more attacks. He was right. Over the next 20 minutes, the Luftwaffe came at them 3 more times. Each time, Miller's flight held formation, worked together, used their tactics. They didn't get any more kills, but they didn't lose anyone either, and they protected their sector of the bomber stream. That was the mission. That was success. On the way home, crossing back over the channel, Miller finally allowed himself to relax slightly. His fuel was running low, his body was exhausted from the constant tension and G-forces, but they'd all survived. All 4 aircraft were undamaged, and they'd learned. The landing at Debden was routine this time. No emergency vehicles, no bullet holes to count. Romano met Miller as he climbed out of the cockpit, grinning broadly. "Heard on the radio, Lieutenant. You got yourself a confirmed kill. That's 6 total now, right?" 6, Miller confirmed. But they didn't feel the same. The 5 victories over Japanese aircraft had been won through individual skill and aggression. This one had been won through discipline and teamwork. Maybe that was the real lesson. The debriefing lasted 2 hours. Major Harrison was pleased. The group had lost only 1 aircraft, and they'd claimed 9 enemy fighters destroyed. The bombers had suffered losses, but fewer than on previous missions. Progress, Harrison called it. Miller called it learning. Afterward, he sought out Rhodes in the intelligence section. The captain was updating his files, adding notes from today's mission. "It worked," Miller said simply. "The tactics you showed me, they worked." Rhodes looked up, surprised. "You used them?" "All of them. Energy fighting, mutual support, disciplined breaks. We split a German formation, forced them to commit, then attacked from their blind spot. 1 destroyed, the rest scattered." "Anyone hurt?" "Not even a scratch." Rhodes smiled, a genuine expression of relief and satisfaction. "Then maybe we're finally figuring this out. The Luftwaffe has had their own way for too long. It's about time we made them play by our rules instead." Miller pulled up a chair. "I want to share this with the whole group, not just my flight. Everyone needs to understand these tactics." "You think Harrison will go for it?" "I think Harrison wants to keep his pilots alive. If I can show him a way to do that and still complete the mission, he'll listen." They worked late into the evening preparing a presentation. Miller sketched diagrams, wrote notes, organized his thoughts. Rhodes contributed technical details about German aircraft performance, intelligence on their tactical doctrine, observations from British pilots who'd been fighting longer. By midnight, they had something comprehensive. The next morning, Miller requested a meeting with Major Harrison. The group commander listened to the proposal, asked pointed questions, then nodded slowly. All right, Lieutenant. You've got 1 hour with the full group tomorrow morning. Make it count. Word spread quickly through the squadron. The new guy, the pilot who'd nearly been shot down on his first mission, was going to teach tactics. Some pilots were curious. Others were skeptical. Who was this lieutenant to tell veteran fighter pilots how to fight? Miller stood before them in the briefing room, 40 pilots watching him with varying degrees of interest. He felt nervous, more nervous than he'd felt going into combat, but he pushed through it. 3 days ago, I almost died, he began. I made every mistake you can make fighting the Luftwaffe. I tried to dogfight a German ace on his terms, and he shot me to pieces. I survived through luck and because the Republic engineers built the toughest fighter in the sky. But luck runs out. I don't want to depend on luck again, and I don't want any of you to either. He turned to the blackboard and began drawing. This is how the Germans fight. They use altitude, speed, and discipline. They don't turn with us. They don't chase us. They attack once from advantage, then reset. If we try to beat them at their own game, we'll lose. But if we force them to fight our way, we have a chance. For the next 45 minutes, Miller laid it out. Energy tactics, mutual support, boom and zoom, the split break. Using the P-47's diving speed and high-altitude performance, resisting the urge to chase, fighting smart instead of hard. Some pilots took notes. Others listened intently. A few still looked doubtful, but Miller saw understanding dawning on most faces. These were smart men, trained aviators, and they recognized truth when they heard it. Captain Ed Morris, a flight leader with 8 victories, raised his hand. What about when we have altitude advantage? Do we just dive through and run? Or do we try to engage? Good question, Miller replied. If we have the advantage, if we're higher, faster, better positioned, then yes, we engage. But we do it once, hard, then we assess. Did we score hits? Is the enemy disorganized? If yes, maybe we press. If no, we climb back up and reset. The key is never giving away our advantage chasing a single enemy. What if he's about to kill one of ours? Someone else asked. Then you engage immediately, absolutely. Protecting your wingman, protecting the formation, that's always the priority. But after you've driven off the threat, you reset. You don't chase him back to Berlin trying to finish him off. Lieutenant Jack Weber, who'd been flying combat since the group arrived, stood up. I've been doing it wrong, he said quietly. I've been chasing. I've been trying to turn with them. 2 weeks ago, I almost bought it, because I followed a 190 into a climbing turn and his wingman nearly got me. Everything you're saying makes sense, I didn't want to admit I was wrong. None of us want to admit that, Miller said. But the Germans had been perfecting these tactics for 4 years. We've been here for weeks. There's no shame in learning from them, in adapting our approach. The shame would be in refusing to learn and getting killed because of pride. Major Harrison stood up from the back of the room. Lieutenant Miller is right. Starting tomorrow, we drill these tactics. Flight leaders, work with your pilots. Practice the formations, the brakes, the communication. We're going to make this standard operating procedure for the entire group. The meeting broke up with pilots clustering around the diagrams, discussing, debating, asking Miller questions. He answered them all patiently, sharing everything he knew. This wasn't about him being right or proving anything. This was about survival. This was about turning inexperienced pilots into veterans instead of casualties. That evening, Miller sat on his bunk writing a letter home. He paused, thinking about what to say. How could he explain what he'd learned? How could he describe the transformation from arrogant ace to humbled student to tactical instructor, all in the span of a few days? The letter remained unfinished. Some things couldn't be explained in words on paper, couldn't be reduced to sentences that would pass through military censors. Miller folded it away and tried to sleep. 2 weeks passed. The weather held, and the 8th Air Force flew mission after mission into Germany. Miller's flight became a cohesive unit, 4 pilots who thought and moved as one. They perfected their radio discipline, their mutual support, their energy tactics. Other flights in the squadron began adopting the same methods. The results spoke for themselves. Losses decreased. The ratio of enemy aircraft destroyed to friendly aircraft lost shifted in favor of the Americans. The Luftwaffe still fought with skill and determination, but now they faced opponents who understood the game, who refused to play by the old rules. On a cold morning in late November, Miller found himself at 28,000 feet over western Germany again, escorting bombers to targets in the Ruhr Valley. The mission had been quiet so far, too quiet. His instincts, sharpened by weeks of combat, told him something was wrong. "Stay alert," he told his flight. "They're out here somewhere." Chen spotted them first. Bandits, 12 o'clock level, 5 miles. Big formation. Miller saw them, at least 20 German fighters, flying straight toward the bombers in a disciplined line. This wasn't an ambush from altitude. This was a direct challenge, a head-on attack, and there was no time for elaborate tactics. "All Keyworth flights, bandits inbound 12 o'clock, Major Harrison's voice came over the radio. "Head-on attack. Hold your fire until 300 yards, then give them everything you've got." The two formations rushed toward each other at combined speeds exceeding 600 miles per hour. Miller picked a target, a Focke-Wulf 190 at the front of the German formation, and lined up his gun sight. His hands were steady, his breathing was calm. This was just physics now, just geometry and timing. The range collapsed. 400 yards, 350, 300. Miller pressed the trigger and felt his Thunderbolt shudder as all 8 guns fired. The sky filled with tracers from both sides, a lethal crossfire of lead and steel. The Focke-Wulf in his sights seemed to fly into his bullet stream. Pieces flew off, smoke erupted. Then the formations interpenetrated, Germans and Americans flashing past each other in a chaotic instant, and Miller was through, climbing, looking back to assess damage. 2 German fighters were falling, trailing fire. 1 American P-47 was smoking badly, turning for home. The rest of the German formation had scattered, their attack broken up by the head-on defense. "Reform on me," Miller called. His flight came together smoothly, all 4 aircraft accounted for, all undamaged. They climbed back to position and continued the escort. The bombers reached their target and dropped their loads. Anti-aircraft fire filled the sky with black puffs, but the formations held together, professional and disciplined. The return flight was uneventful. The Luftwaffe had shot its bolt for the day. Back at Debden, the intelligence officer confirmed Miller's Focke-Wulf as destroyed, his 7th victory. Officially an ace by any nation's standards. But the number meant less to him than the fact that all his pilots had come home safely. That evening, Major Harrison called Miller to his office. The commander looked tired, but satisfied. "The group commander from the 4th Fighter Group called today," Harrison said. "They've been hearing about our tactics, our reduced loss rate. They want to send some of their flight leaders over to observe our methods." "That's good, sir," Miller replied. "It is. And it's because of what you started, Lieutenant. You took a hard lesson, learned from it, and shared that knowledge. That's leadership. That's what we need." Harrison opened a folder on his desk. "I'm recommending you for promotion to captain and flight commander. We need more pilots who think the way you do." Miller was surprised. "Sir, Thank you. But I just did what needed to be done." "Exactly. And you'll keep doing it. Dismissed, Captain." Miller walked out into the cold English evening. The stars were coming out, the same stars that had watched over countless battles, countless young men learning the hard lessons of war. Somewhere over Germany, Luftwaffe pilots were probably preparing for tomorrow's missions, veterans and novices alike, all caught in the same terrible machine. He thought about the German pilot who'd nearly killed him 2 weeks ago, the ace with the victory marks on his fuselage. Was he still alive? Had he taught his wingmen the same lessons Miller had taught his? Did he lie awake at night wondering about the American pilots he'd face tomorrow? The war would go on. More missions, more battles, more hard lessons. But Miller and his pilots would face them together, with discipline and mutual support, fighting smart instead of just fighting hard. They wouldn't try to beat the Germans at their own game anymore. They'd make the Germans play by American rules. Miller looked up at the stars one more time, then headed back to the barracks. Tomorrow would bring another mission, another test. But tonight, his pilots were alive and learning, and that was victory enough. The end.